As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. Joining me is someone you've heard a few times on The Malcolm Effect, someone I consider a mentor and comrade. Welcome back to The Malcolm Effect, Max Ajl. How's it going?
It's great. Thank you so much for having me, Mawandu. It's a pleasure to return to your domain.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come on and what will be a necessary conversation and an important intervention. There has been a lot of chat online. It ranges from why is the US doing this in regards to its unrelenting, unwavering support of Israel. Some would say, quote unquote, I'm doing scare quotes right now, the Zog, the Israel lobby. And it ranges from perhaps some of those who are even considered on the left, or they consider themselves to be on the left. But even them, they don't seem to understand the role that Zionism plays within the region, how it's connected to US imperialism, and who controls who. That's what people would like to talk about. So I guess beginning to unpack this, how do you understand the relationship between the United States and Israel?
It's for me, it's a bit of a misnomer at this point to even be discussing so much of a relationship, in the sense that you don't have a relationship between a set of bodily organs and a hand. You have a contiguity because they're all actually part of the same mechanism. They're the same process. So probably an analytical error increasingly starts with separating the two. And once you understand that these are actually joint mechanisms, that they're very much part of the same overall kind of body, you can begin to discuss a different question, that is what joins them, what benefit do they get, what flows link the two. And to continue the metaphor, a lot of people are like, why doesn't the US cut it off? It's like, well, yes, you could cut off your hand and you would survive, right? But the cost would be rather large, and it would be part of the assessment. Like maybe your hand is gangrened and you would need to cut it off, right? And then the blood would no longer flow into it. But again, it's very unhelpful at this point, not least because what constitutes a state, or what constitutes an economy, to take the abstractions, the reifications of mainstream discourse, right? What constitutes those things is capital, right? In essence, capital and militaries. Militaries are made up of personnel and technology, which themselves, in general, have to be serving a goal of capitalism if they're linked with capitalist nation states at some level. So in the first case, in this discussion, and I say this preliminary to a broader point, which is that in this discussion, no one actually discusses, on our side either, to be honest, which I take our side to be people who think that the actions in Israel are perceived as in the interest of the ruling class, also in the United States. No one on either side actually discusses what is the pattern of U.S. accumulation, what is the structure of the firms that are active in Israel, what is their ownership structure, what are the mechanisms of accumulation of U.S.-owned capital at this juncture, and also what is, for that matter, the Zionist social structure, right? It is a society. It's a class society in a sense. It's a colonial capitalist class society, which means it has a class structure, which is not to say it has like a working class, but it's to say that it has a law of motion that cannot be reduced to ideology. So, in fact, the whole basic operations that historical materialists would normally proceed through when trying to understand any social processes in our world, these are not even taken, right? And I see it as a debility on what passes often for our side as well. Like people will regurgitate this cliche, the U.S., Israel is the world's biggest aircraft carrier. This becomes then an operating hypothesis within Marxist social science and political work. This is very silly. It's not an aircraft carrier, right? So we actually need to do some work, but in fact, we have to agree on some basic premises about how we even think about social reality, which is not done in this debate, unfortunately.
So before we get into the specifics, right, and talk about US capitalist accumulation, development, de-development in the region, in the Arab Iranian region, when you say the US, right, because I think some people are getting confused that we have a brand of the US now. You have the Marjorie Taylor Greens, for example. You have these folks who are quote unquote America first, right? The first Republican to say genocide, for example. All these people. So when we're talking about the US and the US's goal and those within in government, etc., who are we talking about?
I think this is a tendency, but it's also, and it's not a tendency without history, like Paul Finley, for example, James Oborazek. It's not a tendency without a history in the U.S., right? I mean, it comes and goes, and it reflects a certain popular consciousness, to be sure, and it can even reflect an ideological and unease with Israeli behavior that then passes through the prism of a reactionary worldview. So you have this, but thus far it's a phenomenon at the margins. I mean, it's not really affecting the Trump policy, and it's also not affecting the Trump coalition, which is sewing together a variety of social forces with distinct ideologies. I mean, you have your Marjorie Taylor Greens, you have your Christian Zionists, you have your very powerful Jewish Zionists, who are in capital-wise much more influential than the Christian Zionists, to be sure. And then you have, the upper middle class Zionist Jewish social base also, which is disproportionately, increasingly shifting to the Republican Party. So you have a variety of forces that are kind of yanked together into the Republican coalition, and we see murmurings, of course, but I don't really think it should be registered as a significant phenomenon yet within the right. Although you do see it, you see it also in the military, where you've always had a certain measure of dissent, of course, with in the military as well. So I just think we should keep it in perspective.
No, I appreciate that. So, okay, let's talk specifics now. Since we are not of those who I guess, unjoin Israel and the United States and act like they're separate entities, right? Or there's some kind of power struggle. So to help us understand the role of US imperialism in West Asia and the role that Israel plays within that larger picture and larger structure and larger plan, what is the United States' goal as it pertains to West Asia, as it pertains to de-development, as it pertains to accumulation?
So the U.S. goal has shifted over time, and it shifts in reaction to the nature of the challenges it perceives in the Arab-Iranian region or West Asia. The historical most important special relationship, and this is loosely alluded to in some of these polemics, is of course with Saudi Arabia, right? Which and then the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and Kuwait, which are critical to the recycling petrodollars, the purchasing of U.S. treasuries, therefore the stability of the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency. Also, they are major arms purchasers from the United States, and this relationship has become, in fact, much more intense since the nationalizations or pseudo nationalizations of the early 1970s, when you had to actually find mechanisms rather for the recycling of the petrodollars, rather than it being under the direct vertical control of the U.S. Multinationals themselves, right? The big seven oil companies. Israel is, of course, a latecomer on the scene in a certain sense. I mean, it's well known, and Kanafani was writing about it, that Israel was actually becoming a garrison state in the Arab region already by the 1930s. And this was well consolidated by 1939 through the Israeli destruction of what was like an anti-capitalist, anti-landlord, anti-Zionist, and anti-imperialist revolt that shook the Arab region, right? It was making news in every Arab country, all of which were under colonial or semi-colonial control at that juncture. It was a major geopolitical event, right? And by the end of it, the Zionists were sufficiently militarily consolidated, and in fact, in their industries and the bases of support from British imperialism, their paramilitary that was trained in that war, to have become strong enough that the Nakba was actually essentially foregone by that point because of the relative strength of the Zionist parastate institutions. You begin to see a shift in U.S. thinking, which was influenced, of course, by the domestic Jewish electoral concerns in terms of the support for partition. But you begin to be a shift in U.S. strategic thinking in '49, where the U.S. military was quite impressed with the performance of the Israeli army against the Arab armies, and kind of was interested in it, but not interested in it enough to consider it a major investment, a source for investment. Although, again, at this point, two other sources of investment were lubricated or allowed by the U.S., one of which was, of course, the nascent kind of Jewish petty bourgeoisie and bourgeoisie in the West, which funneled huge amounts of donations, that is, capital transfers that did not expect any sort of return through the Jewish Agency, the Jewish National Fund, and so forth, into the Zionist state, and really substantially helped build it up. And then, of course, there were the German capital transfers, which were part and parcel of the rebuilding of kind of basically Nazi West Germany under U.S. control, right? And the U.S. looked quite well on these capital transfers, actually. It was very happy that they were occurring. And to the extent that capital is fungible, the U.S. investments in rebuilding Nazi West Germany went alongside what were not actually capital transfers, because most of it had to be used for the purchases of German and other Western European goods. So what was transferred were capital goods, oil, and so forth to the Zionist state from 48 to 1965. And so this was a kind of hothouse atmosphere within which Israel could rapidly build up its capacities. And throughout this period, the states got warmer and warmer to Israel. Starting, it started to accelerate, even particularly under Kennedy, and then Lyndon Johnson really became very enamored of Israel, and they started to see by 65, 66 that Israel would be very useful for slamming Arab nationalism. Now, that's the Israeli component of it, but. And of course, I should bracket here. I should pause here and state all of this is normally rendered through saying like Israel was a Cold War ally and now it's not a Cold War ally. And I'm like, bro, what do you mean by the Cold War, right? What do you mean by the Cold War? The Cold War was not cold, it was hot. And the Cold War was not a war against the Soviet Union. The Cold War was a war against autonomous centers of capital accumulation, no matter the social kind of the political scaffolding or even the law of value operative. Like what was not allowed was populist agrarian reform. What was not allowed was sovereign industrialization. Was not allowed was autonomous attempts at accumulation and so forth. The idea was to have things linked and subordinate to the U.S. in this period. At the same time, what the U.S. was in a war is against this idea of popular developmentalism, and that was incarnated in the Arab region in a huge variety of movements. So the communist movement, the Nasserist movement, the Ba'athist movement in its various iterations and so forth. And the U.S. was investing all across the region through a huge variety of modalities to keep this under control. And so it understood at a certain point that Nasserism was very popular and Baathism was very popular, and it had to deal with it. It had to accept it for the time being, which didn't mean that it liked it. It didn't like it because it understood that subtending these forces were two really inseparable ways of thinking. One of them was basically an idea for self-reliant autonomous development, not using that language, but that's what the development plans really look like, including sovereign industrialization, including attempts to carry out agrarian reform, which the plans were much more radical than whatever could be implemented because of the balance of social power in those states. And understanding that all of this, within all of the radical Arab states, and even the non-radical Arab states like Jordan, all of this was in turn linked to anti-Zionism opposition to Israel, right? So it was understood that this was, the U.S. elite understood that this was a package deal. And it also understood that increasingly Egypt and Syria in particular were destabilizing or threatened to destabilize the monarchies, right? They or the U.S. aligned, whatever you want to call Lebanon, right? So, they successfully, as the coups started to accelerate, the 1952, 1958, Libya, 1969, right? They understood that they needed to put a stop to this process, right? I mean, what happened there was a huge Nasserist mobilizations in Jordan that needed to be controlled, and so forth, and of course the intervention in Lebanon in 1958. So they understood this was something that had to be controlled, and Israel ended up being a useful tool to kind of deflate this, to destroy the appeal of Nasserism and unity under these so-called petty bourgeois regimes. Not maybe a very helpful term in terms of our understanding. It was understood that Israel would be enormously helpful in doing this. Is not very disputed in the historiography, that Israel was very helpful in so doing, and was also therefore helpful, in fact, in kind of eliminating this threat to the Gulf states, which were really axial for U.S. accumulation, right, during that period. Then you have the post-1967, especially post-1970 period, say to 1990, where you basically have processes going on between so-called Israel and the United States and within so-called Israel itself. I mean, on the one hand, Israel itself became because of the amount of investment that had been possible from 1948 to 1967, had become really central. Had been really able to accumulate a kind of developmental base. So spending on education had been enormous. It had gotten, the original accumulation, we can say, took place at the expense of Palestinians. And so there was a massive redistribution of land and building stock and wealth itself, right? With a lot of structural parallels, of course, to how the U.S. had been able to carry out an endogenous primitive accumulation on the back of the indigenous people of the United States, right? And then there were all these capital flows, some of which were, in fact, for profit, but a lot of which did not require a short run or even a short-run accounting return, although they offered geopolitical returns, I would argue, which we can get into at various levels. And so this kind of created the basis for a massive military-industrial base. I mean, what became Israeli aircraft industries, I think, saw its turnover increase by 8 or 15% during this period from like 1958 to 1967, something like that, right? So they started to develop this kind of impressive, given the newness of the state structure itself, industrial base. And what's important is, and this is always forgotten, is that there is no more structurally, because of the racism embedded in Zionist ideology, you have a built-in racist labor aristocracy forming there, right? You have an ally that is just as solid as the engineers at Raytheon or Boeing, except it's a whole society that supports, that will not break from its racist opposition to the Arabs, right? So it's actually useful. It's structural antagonism, and therefore it's reliant to the popular classes of the region, is structural to the state formation itself, right? This makes it a very reliable ally at a certain level. Now, there's people, of course, I think there are serious, at a certain level, arguments that people say it's not so reliable anymore, whatever. But this is just kind of created this kind of colonial capitalist labor aristocracy, was very helpful for U.S. capital. Now, post-1967, post-1970, U.S. aid started to flow in, right? Now, U.S. aid is not really aid. U.S. aid is, in fact, grants for the purchasing of U.S. military equipment, right? So on the one hand, you have two mechanisms that are going on internal to the region, right? One, you have a huge amount of basically weapons that are being given to Israel, paid for by the U.S. taxpayer, and that are basically direct transfers to Boeing, Raytheon, and so forth. On the other hand, 25% of that is uniquely allowed to be spent in Israel itself. So what happens is that you see General Motors and so forth, Iran, going into the Zionist entity and beginning to set up independent industrial plants there, right? So you begin to see the merger of U.S. and Israeli capital. It's embryonic, and it's particularly in the military sector at that juncture, but it's beginning to form there, right? That's where it becomes very important. Eventually, you would see the process actually begin to go the other direction as well. The other aspect is, of course, that with the U.S. defeat in Vietnam, right, the U.S. needed, basically the Pentagon complex needed a new guaranteed market for its weapons. Now, a lot of the fellows seem to be kind of thinking capitalism is like Adam Smith, and markets just make themselves, and so forth. But in fact, markets are politically engineered. We know that, right? We know markets have always been historical creations. And if you want to keep an arms race going on, you need to create reasons for it. You need to create wars, right? So what is Israel doing? It's selling instability, right? It's quite the opposite of this idea that it's selling hegemonic stability, that it's disturbing hegemonic stability. It's actually selling hegemonic instability. Two other dynamics. A third dynamic, which begins to become more significant as well, is that the military sector begins to get very significant by the 1980s. And you begin to have a kind of large corporations that begin to kind of become incubators for high tech, which becomes more significant to the story later on the one hand. Furthermore, of course, you have another process, which is the psychological component of Arab defeat, which has been written about by Yassin al-Hafez, which has been written about by Ali Qadri, who is conspicuously absent in these debates, actually, which I actually find it remarkable. I'm like, well, if you want to debate someone, you actually have to debate with the strongest advocate of a position. That's how you actually have a substantive debate. No one debates with Ali Qadri. It's not helpful even for sharpening one's own position. It's just ignored. So therefore, it's not a serious discussion at that level. So he's saying, okay, that Israel is ingraining a state of defeat, and this is true. I mean, this was how it was perceived by British and U.S. defense analysts. I mean, they were calling Syria in 1966. They were like, it's a Middle Eastern Cuba. Was Syria after post-1970 a Middle Eastern Cuba? No, it was something else entirely that wasn't no more threatening to combine radical, even socialist or Marxist redistribution with opposition to Israel. It became a kind of confrontation state, yes, with a hardened military and so forth, but it was no longer what it was in the 1963-1970 period, and this was because of Israel. So Israel did something very significant in terms of the engineering of Arab consciousness, and this is also not part of the debate. It's also forgotten that you can't just engineer. You cannot make people feel they are defeated people, right? I think, who said that? Like Ben Gurion or Jabotinsky or one of these thugs. You cannot make people feel that they're defeated people just once. You have to keep doing it, right? It's the most obvious thing in the world. You cannot just defeat people once and think that they will stay subjugated, right? This is the most common sense thing in the world, especially for Marxists or leftists who are wagering on the emancipatory potential of human beings, right? Therefore, the tacit understanding is that human beings will have, if organized, will be able to move in directions of popular empowerment. Now, the other dynamic, of course, is that because of the Israeli plausible separation from the U.S. kind of beating heart of accumulation and capital, Israel was able to be a major dealer of worldwide repression to all sorts of regimes. I mean, to Togo, to Rhodesia, to South Africa, where it had the greatest relationships. Death squads all across Africa, death squads in Central America, death squads in South America, the semi-fascist and anti-Semitic Argentinian regime, killing tens of thousands of leftists, very much supporting the Brazilian coup d'etat, Paraguay, Central America. Tad Iran was centrally involved in administering the database that was actually keeping track, that was organizing the mass killing of indigenous people in Guatemala and so forth. So you had all of these dynamics that Israel was perceived, was correctly perceived as a very important ally. And then this then is waved away as a Cold War process. But it's not a Cold War process to carry out a counterinsurgency, right? Now, this kind of brings us up to the 1990s, right? And then in the early 1990s, two things happen, or many things happen, in fact, right? One, it's true, the Soviet Union fell, right? But so that kind of was very helpful in terms of erasing the utility of alternatives. Second of all, in the first Intifada was basically unable to achieve any meaningful result for the Palestinian people, primarily, I think, because of the fall of the Soviet Union, which was a backstop for Iraq, but also for the leftists in Palestine themselves and so forth. But what happened then is that the relationship between the U.S. and Israel began to shift a little bit. On the one hand, the settlement project exploded during that period, right? So I think 1991 to 1999 saw a doubling of the settler population. I don't have the exact figures at hand. I think it's something from like 200 to 400,000 or something like that, right? So the settlement project, which was, of course, it was intrinsic to Zionist ideology, and actually it's often left there, the settlement project is a process of primitive accumulation of land, right? Alongside the export of social contradictions internal to your population or internal to a settler population, right? You are taking land basically from the periphery or the peripheral popular classes, and you are transferring capital directly in the form of land to some form of the labor aristocracy, right? Through the mechanism of state violence, right? And for one thing, so the U.S. always supports this, right? The U.S. supported in South Africa, the U.S. supported in Zimbabwe. If you ran against the grain and tried to actually sublate and the process and reverse the trajectory and actually give land from a settler aristocracy to your black popular classes, then the U.S. will try to economically immolate you via sanctions, right? Which it did in Zimbabwe. So on the one hand, of course, you have this tendency, which is very much linked to the Israeli, is a fusion of ideological and material tendencies within Israeli society. Of course, it's Zionism, but it's also Zionism as the expression of land theft, which is also the expression of land colonization from popular classes to colonial capitalist settler aristocracy. It also is palliating the religious right, which is actually created after the establishment of Israel by the Israelis themselves as a kind of social integument, right? I mean, you needed to kind of activate religion at a certain juncture, and then it kind of became a bit of, not a Pandora's box, whatever, I'm forgetting my analogies. It became kind of something that was complicated for the secular colonial Zionists to control, the so-called religious right. But at the same time, you have a very substantial element of ideological settlers, although the ones from Israel themselves are probably a minority. You also have a way of dealing with your internal social contradictions within the Zionist entity itself. That is, instead of having any struggle for distribution, you move, which you obviously, again, it's helpful to internally engineer. You have land theft and you settle people in the settlement project, which is cheap real estate because it's stolen real estate, right? And the settlements themselves, of course, give something to do to the army, which is another structural component of Israeli society that you are not going to just demobilize, right? So, in fact, the army becomes very enmeshed in the administration and control of the occupied territories. And so by the end of the decade, on the one hand, you have basically no Palestinian opposition, effective. There are things going on that are gestating, but you don't have effective opposition to this process, right? It's more or less going on peacefully, with the U.S. pouring in aid nonstop to facilitate it. And also the land sales themselves are becoming, there's settler Zionists, American Zionists who are investing increasingly in the settlements themselves in the 1990s. This became kind of a lucrative frontier for these people also. Now, so you had this kind of fusion of social forces, right? Some of them, loosely call ideological, some of them you can loosely call class, some of them loosely call institutional. Now, what's significant, right, from the perspective of the discussion about the U.S.-Israeli special relationship is that this was not, on the one hand, this was not disruptive to the U.S. administration of the Arab-Iranian region at that juncture. This was more or less going smoothly because the Palestinian organizations had been so effectively disorganized by the Oslo process and the accompanying NGOization of Palestinian civil society, the disorganization of resistance factions, the terror listing, the severing of material support possibilities between the Palestinian exile community and Palestinians still living in historical Palestine and organization and so forth, right? The situation was pacified. Meanwhile, the settlement process is exploding. And at the same time, you begin to see a shift in the kind of Israeli mode of accumulation itself, which is increasingly moving into the IDF, and like Unit 8200 are becoming kind of incubators for all forms of security technology. And this is kind of the new horizon of investment and accumulation within Israel itself. And here you begin to see substantive ties between Israel and the United States, which are going alongside, of course, the Israeli incubation of what are, and I don't mean this in a normative sense, but are very top flight on a world scale research universities for technology production, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, a workforce that is 100% loyal to colonialism and racism and ultimately imperialism and is only paid half the salary of their peers in the U.S. So the engineers are only paid half as much, right? Now, what you begin to see here is basically an effective fusion between U.S. and Israeli capital. So increasingly, from this point on, Israel has the highest, after Canada, the highest percentage of its firms are listed on the New York Stock Exchange. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange is moving in full sync, is basically moving in sync with the NASDAQ. You have branches of the Israeli military industries that are increasingly being set up in the late 90s and the 2000s. You have people with dual passports going back and forth. And so you begin to really just have an organic fusion of the Israeli and U.S. capitalist classes, right? You know, we don't even know the number of dual passports or never mind the number of Israelis that are living in the United States at this juncture, right? We don't have numbers on them for obvious reasons, right? But what we do know is that there's basically an organic fusion that becomes even more marked by the 2000s. I mean, I forget what year it was, but soon you have Intel, Microsoft, another one was huge, which just set a $25 billion investment, which I'm forgetting its name, are setting up huge installations in Israel. And Microsoft is like the very expression of like Christian tech capital in the United States, right? And it is setting up there for profit, right? That is a arena of great profit to it. Now, the fact that it's an arena of great profit means it basically needs to uphold a more or less stable environment for its operations and for its accumulation strategies, more or less, looking both in the short, medium, and long term. And this is kind of where we begin to actually get at some of the answer to your question. And so you begin to have a massive, starting in, I think, 2003, 2004, you see a massive process of U.S. venture capital moving into Israel and purchasing these firms that have basically been incubated through the Israeli state, which is, of course, subsidized by the U.S. state, and the Israeli army, which is subsidized, again, by the U.S. state and Unit 8200 and so forth. You begin to have a process of merger and acquisition of these firms, and they are buying them because they like what they're doing in terms of surveillance, in terms of other forms of software production. Primarily, it's a lot of software, but it's also a lot of hardware. And also because, of course, there's an explosion. Israel becomes a specialist in optics, also drone technology, which we see are increasingly central for warfare. And so this is kind of the new phase, whereas before you could intelligibly speak of kind of these separate formations, that is the Israeli ruling class and the Israeli so-called economy and so forth. By the early 2000s, you really have a huge fusion of the most important sectors of the two at many levels, right? And this is going some part, I think, towards explaining a lot of the endurance of the special relationship in the face of what we've seen now. Now, I've actually only taken us to 2003 or so, but I do want to stop now because I've just been talking uninterrupted for a very long time. I can keep going.
I was going to say, actually, I want you to keep going, actually, because I think my next question was going to be, okay, how do we understand this moment in regards to, like, okay, what's taking place in, and not to go too much into it, but, you know, okay, the call for disarmament, the Western states that are saying they're going to possibly recognize a demilitarized Palestine, the disarmament of Hamas, the disarmament of Hezbollah, the bombing of Iran. But I think before we get there, I think you should actually carry on from the 2000s to now.
Okay, so at the 2000s, right, you basically see, the U.S. is basically carrying out a form of slightly colder destruction of all of its enemies. This is kind of, it has achieved a kind of horrible but cold peace or a cold, not peace, but cold kind of settlement for the time being, or paralysis even. It's paralyzed time in the West Bank and Gaza. It's proceeding to sanction its enemies in Libya, Iran. Iraq is under absolutely debilitating sanctions, right? It's carrying out on this process. This is where we see the process of de-development. Egypt is carrying out, again, a cold process of de-development via economics, right? So from 1990 to 2000, you actually see rural poverty become almost absolute in Egypt. That is, everyone is extremely poor in a half-peasant society. Everyone. So you have a process of massive poverty, which is in sync with what's going on in the world system, right? During this period in the world system, of course, you have wars, but what you have is actually a massive kind of advance through economics of the ruling class on a world scale. You have the collapse of the Soviet Union. You have Gini coefficients increasing on a world scale. You have the dismantlement, partial dismantling of kind of state-directed forms of capitalism. For example, in India was very well known. You have neoliberalism, which had its early laboratories beginning even further accelerating in Latin America and so forth, right? And so you have this kind of process where this is proceeding kind of smoothly. And then in 2000, politically speaking, militarily speaking, you have the U.S. overall moving to a kind of hot war model once again in the Arab-Iranian region itself, right? And this is when it's starting to move towards its aggressive war-making and decapitation operations that are in sync with what U.S. planners had wanted to do since the 1990s, having sufficiently weakened their targets. So they said it very clearly. The U.S. were like, we want to take out Libya, we want to take out Iran, we want to take out Iraq, we want to take out Syria. Then they did all of these things, and people are like, well, they're doing it because of Israel. Or alternatively, they'll be like, well, the U.S. didn't take out Syria. And you're like, but they announced that they were going to do that. Like, were you paying attention? Like, was that just like, is that like with the same amount of serious as you tweet on twitter.com? Like, these are actually like state planners. Like, they're serious about like announcing their enemies. So the U.S. basically begins to level these kind of desiccated Arab republics, right? So it takes out Iraq in 2003. It tries to make war through Israel. This was very much green-lighted. I mean, this was understood as a U.S. war at the time. In 2006, it tries to take out Hezbollah in Lebanon. In reaction to that defeat, it activates the sectarian militias, and it begins to carry out its regime change plans in consort with Qatar in Libya and also in Syria, right? So it begins to kind of move to the wide-scale demolition of the Arab region. And I think this is very consistent with the kind of mode of accumulation the U.S. by then is practicing, which is, people kind of understand this. They're like, yes, arms sales to the Gulf states, yes, petrodollar recycling, but they forget the aspect you have to wipe out any nascent form of political opposition to it. Like, you need to consolidate your wins. And if you want to consolidate your wins from the perspective of ruling class capital, you have to keep on beating your enemies into the ground, right? And so, in fact, arms sales continue and go through the roof, right? Meanwhile, the fusion between the U.S. and Israeli kind of so-called capitalist sectors becomes essentially complete during this period. Meanwhile, of course, like the disorganization of the U.S. left from like 2008 to 2019 or 20 is more or less total, right? Through this kind of mass infusion of NGO money and so forth, and social democratic, racist ideology and so forth. And so this is kind of the model. The model becomes, of course, basically de-development. Now, why? This is where people often be like, well, the U.S. wants stability. Now, this is actually a proposition that has never actually
Can I just interject there? Because I think, sorry, Max, I think for the purposes of when we say accumulation, and I know it's a basic question for political economy, when we say de-development and accumulation and US style, what do we mean? Just lay that out so people can have an understanding before you go into it.
Accumulation is basically an increase in the value of corporations, the value and even magnitude of their fixed physical assets. It's a reflection of the future profit flow of corporations. I mean, that is how capitalization and therefore accumulation is essentially measured, right? It's a reflection of future profit flows, whether that's interest on bonds, which are kind of basically the fiscal security of states, which in turn is basically a reflection of an investment in their power, right? Or it's a anticipated future return, corporate holdings themselves in the stock market, right? That's literally, it's in a relationship, of course, with increases in the productive base, but the relationship is a bit complicated too, right? It can be distended from it, or it can reflect future anticipated earnings rather than present anticipated earnings. So this is why I tend to like to point out people, when we talk about de-development, we're actually talking about something else. We're not in the quantitative realm of accumulation. We're actually in the realm of the destruction of productive industries, the destruction of farmland, the dislocation of farmers from their land and their flight into cities or to become refugees. Of course, the Agrarian region is a major producer of refugees. We're talking about the destruction of buildings and physical infrastructure. We're talking about the destruction of public healthcare systems and schools. We're talking about the destruction of the state capacity to administer all of these things. These things, of course, happen in war, but what's salient about de-development in general, and that makes it different, is that it's kind of dissolving the capacity of regeneration. Like this happens in wars, and then states carry out rebuilding with the dislocated resources. This doesn't really happen in the Arab-Iranian region because the state itself has also been dismantled, and the capacity, the geopolitical framework within which it's possible to have stability and then rebuild, that doesn't really exist, right? Now, this then raises the question, why is the U.S. doing this? Why is the U.S. carrying out this process of accumulation in this way, in such a violent way, right? Now, I want to backtrack a little bit. Because by chance I was reading Seymour Melman, who was this kind of a social democratic industrial engineering professor, and he wrote this book called The Permanent War Economy, right, in like the 1970s or early 1980s. And what he argues is that, and he's establishing it empirically, right, and theoretically, that at a accounting level, the investment in warfare by the United States is actually at the expense of the long-term health of the U.S. productive plant. The multiplier effect of investments, that is kind of the overall economic activity that is generated by military investments, is much lower than would be if they were invested in peacetime industries and so forth, right? And we see this when we compare growth rates, for example, of like the US and China, right? So the same question about a certain type of, that one can construct a kind of theory in which this is irrational, doesn't just apply to Israel, it also applies to US militarization itself. But what this sidesteps is that there's an axial role in actually ensuring the political conditions for capitalist accumulation, which relies on ensuring the disorganization of the working class on a world scale, the installation of an ideology of defeat amongst the working class on a world scale, the repression of the working class on a world scale, and the destruction or besiege or warping of any governments that are trying to represent, in whatever flawed way, the interests of the popular classes, right? That's the political face of engineering, and that is the role. The Pentagon system is not just kind of a backbone for technology development and arms sales and so forth, and a kind of labor aristocratic jobs in the U.S. accumulation process. It's also about ensuring the political and ideological conditions for a system of production, reproduction, and distribution, namely capitalism, that is hierarchical, unequal, and oppressive. And it requires, to use Ali's word, clobbering people, right? And furthermore, what's at stake here is, yes, Israel requires chaos, but the chaos is productive from that perspective. Now, one can argue many things, but this is the perspective of the ruling class, and it is entrenched, of course, by the Zionist institutions, right? But if you look at, for example, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and so forth. On the one hand, a lot of these are projects of the U.S. capitalist class on a broader level. And then there's a subsector of them, the Zionist lobby institutions, that are very much funded by Jewish kind of tech or investment billionaires like Klarman. Now, I think they're basically acting in their interests, and they're acting as the vanguard of the ideological and political disciplining of dissent to the ruling class. And if you look at what they invest in, they don't just invest in Zionism, they also invest in anti-voting rights, and they also invest in attacks on the queer movement, and they also invest in attacks on immigrants and so forth, right? They have a wide portfolio of investments, and you can read about this actually in The Business of Backlash, which was a report I helped write by the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. It's funny, that report, which detailed empirically, carefully, the role of Jewish multimillionaires, Zionist Jewish multimillionaires and billionaires, was at the time attacked as anti-Semitic by the Trotskyite movement in the United States. This was very ludicrous. I mean, because what was actually detailed in that report was precisely, sociologically, therefore historically, the role of a distinct set of ruling class actors in, say, propaganda investments and repression investments that it was argued would serve their capitalist interests. And this was, of course, attacked. Now, of course, like the Trotskyist movement will attack anything that's actually useful, right? I mean, that's kind of their job. And their job is produce things that are not useful. But I just think it's interesting, right? So this was shown relatively empirically. What role were these playing? And so anyway, this was a bit of a diversion from the overall trajectory of I think
that was important, actually. But if you don't mind, take us up to where we are today.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, with this degree of shared capital investments, back and forth, mergers and acquisitions, right? I mean, you have Dell, like I said, not Dell. You have Intel and Microsoft through Microsoft Israel, and this other one, which I forget and I should know, but just announced a $30 billion takeover in occupied Palestine, or a merger or something, or investment in occupied Palestine, I forget the precise detail, right, creates an investment which is amongst all religious portions of the U.S. ruling class in the essential stability of Israel, right? Now, of course, all range of hypotheticals can enter, right? Is a different scenario more amenable to Israel's long-term security? Well, long-term stability and security. I mean, on the one hand, one can argue this. What's silly is that one can argue this about the settlement project itself, right? Was the settlement project helpful for Israel's long-term security and stability, right? Would not Israel be more secure and more stable with hardened armistice lines on the Green Line and a Vichy in the PA, and that was essentially disarmed, right? Would that not have been a more secure and stable option for Israeli accumulation? But then we find, okay, there were all these countervailing interests that I listed earlier that pushed Israel onto a different path and basically seemed at the time more or less acceptable from U.S. power. I mean, because the largest percentage increase in the settlement project occurred under more or less calm conditions from the perspective of power and accumulation during the 1990s, right? I mean, it's accelerated rapidly since, and it's very militarized. It's very brutal. This is not to sidestep those aspects, but I'm talking about the overall perspective of systemic stability. Now, when the problem is, of course, the enduring problem is Palestinian nationalism itself, right? Because we don't need to get into the details of the programs of distinct forces within the Palestinian nationalist formations to arrive at one very simple point, that any non-collaborationist force in Palestine, whether they're arguing for a long-term hudna, whether under coercion they would accept some form of settlement on the 67 border if they could assure also a militarized state and so forth, whether this would be just. My own position is that there should be national liberation in Palestine, but just talking about the very positions of the Palestinian factions, I'm thinking in particular of Hamas's acceptance on some levels of Hamas, of course, for a hudna, right, the long-term truce, whatever one wants to say, all of this would have meant massive restructuring of Israeli society, right? What are you going to do with 550,000 settlers? Where are you going to house them? Where are you going to find jobs for them? What are you going to do with the fact that the even further extreme elements of your own society, right, are invested ideologically and materially in the settlement project itself? That is, you are carrying out a massive engineering project on your own society from the perspective of the Israeli leadership. It's unimaginable. And this is why every single plan put forward envisioned no substantive settlement withdrawal, because it's unimaginable to do that, right? It's a huge risk from the perspective of the Israeli leadership, right? So in fact, the Israeli leadership has found itself, therefore, in front of what one can say is two risks. One is the risk of an October 7th, right? Bracketing these psychopaths who think that like October 7th was like an Israeli plot, right? This is crazy. I think this is very crazy. But, the Israeli leadership basically put itself in front of, had the decision of either one, having to endure a confrontational Palestinian nationalism, backstopped by the Axis, right? And two, the choice of restructuring its society in this very radical way, right? Now, to be sure, and you never know what forces people are talking about when they say the Israel lobby, by the way. I think there is a lobby, and I also think that there's what I think is even more significant is that there's a social base of reaction. For example, there's land sales going on in synagogues. This is wild. So we can say that for the last part of the conversation, it's very clear to me that those institutions should, in the short or medium or long term, be confronted, right? Which is the actual political strategy that flows from, these people who talk about in very vague terms about this. I do think there should be political confrontation with those forces. But bracketing that, right? The Israeli ruling class had itself in front of these forces, in front of these choices, and it chose the path not of an internal kind of spinal surgery, one can say, but the path of thinking that it could basically deal with Palestinian nationalism, right? And it obviously made this case to the U.S., and the U.S. said, okay, that's fine. We think, yes, that we can basically, not only can we basically deal with Palestinian nationalism and keep that issue under control, but furthermore, right, this is because we do see Israel as a major asset, and we believe, one, that this is a mechanism towards its continued existence, a means to its continued existence, and two, contrary-wise, right, we actually, I think, worry about Palestinian nationalism, right? I mean, the U.S., this is long-term in U.S. strategic planning, is that there is a worry, the same way the converse of it, the potential of the detonator effect of Palestinian insurrectionary nationalism, the U.S. ruling class has always been worried about the polarizing effect of Palestinian nationalism if it could not be quarantined and destroyed, right? So again, all of these are entering the calculations. I mean, at varying levels of legibility and at varying levels of visibility. But all of this is part of the thinking, the historical thinking, and the historical debate about how to manage these issues amongst the Israeli and U.S. political leadership, and they also how to manage Arab public opinion. I mean, this is very obvious, right? Now, from October 7th, what the problem of October 7 from the perspective of Israel and the U.S., Israel-U.S., I usually put a dash between them at this point, is that October 7th was like crystallized the fact that Palestinian nationalism, again, was this force that could not be negotiated with. And if Palestinian nationalism is strong enough, it itself is going to force a restructuring of Israel. Like, that is what even a compromise settlement means, a strong restructuring of Israeli society. That is why Palestinian nationalism had to be destroyed. But if Palestinian nationalism is also a detonator, which it is, and it's a point of pride, and it's a point of activation for the radical left, or any radical nationalist forces, or radical progressive Islamic forces in the Arab Iranian region, then Palestinian nationalism risks greater detonations, and that's why you have to slam it into the ground, right? This is what I wrote in my Ebb article. What's being engineered is to defeat them. You have to carry out a counterinsurgency, which is also a process of ideological defeat, and to put people back in their place, right? And this is how U.S. planners and British planners, all planners, have always thought about counterinsurgency, was putting third world forces back in their place and thinking that you could defeat them and kind of undermine the ground, kind of dissolve the soil within which the ideology spread, and also dissolve any capacity for the ideology to take root in a given society. And this is how you disorganize resistance. And so what you can see the rallying effect of Palestinian nationalism in Yemen and in Iran at a different level, right? And it also represents the more radical internationalist wing of Hezbollah, right, which has various internal tendencies, right? And the internationalist tendency, right, which was incarnated also in Nasrallah, was moving. It was at least maybe not moving, but tended to be oriented towards a more internationalist horizon, both for Hezbollah in terms of how it saw its association with the Palestinian struggle, and how it saw both in the world system in terms of a cause for free people and so forth. And you see this also in Abu Ubaida's speeches. You saw it in Sinwar, right? You saw a burgeoning a humanism. You see, of course, elements of Islamism. There's no question. I mean, it's very silly to say that's not part of it. But also you see internationalist appeals, right? Like Kol Ihrar al-Alam, right? You know, these words are not chosen by chance, right? These are internationalist appeals. And I don't mean internationalism in the Marxist sense, but I mean internationalism in the humanist sense. These are internationalist appeals, and they have a risk of activating a lot of people. And they did activate a lot of people. And people began to mobilize not only around Palestine, but also, of course, have always been linking Palestine to all the other array of struggles. And Palestine also then becomes a fault line within the social democratic left itself. Right, as we saw, for example, in the recent DSA, Palestine becomes the fault line through which the conflict between a kind of basically a radical and reformist Popular Front wing of DSA that would like to basically tail right-wing social democrats like AOC and Bernie, or a kind of radical DSA that is open to supporting the electoral option but actually wants to maintain organizational autonomy and also have a hard line about anti-Zionism. That debate was, of course, expressed through anti-Zionism. And also, now, again, one can say, okay, well, Israel and the U.S. could deal with all of that by forcing through a kind of two-state settlement. Okay, first of all, what two-state settlement could be forced through to the Palestinian people? Well, again, like, Palestinian people are not willing to accept settlement on the 67 territory, right? That even after this genocide, that is not an accepted position in the Palestinian national body politic, right? So again, you're back at the option of a forced reconstruction of Israeli society, which means a forced reconstruction of, and this is without even getting into many other things, but this is about get it on a larger geopolitical canvas. But this means a risk to these fixed capital investments that are in the tens of billions of dollars. And so again, this isn't expressed in these terms in U.S. geopolitical conversations, right? But on the other hand, of course, it's real. Like, someone in the head of Intel and the head of Microsoft are talking with Trump, and they're like, well, what are you thinking about doing to deal with this situation? Trump's like, well, we'll get it under control. And, for all the we see it from our perspective, from the perspective of a political and humanitarian catastrophe that is befalling people we care about in Palestine. This is not how they see it. They see it, how much is this destabilizing really our capacity to continue accumulating? And here is where I want to use the infamous word cope. I'm like, people are doing the so-called coping in stating that this war has, in the short term, destabilized the prospects for continued stability of accumulation by Israel. Now, the other thing is, I want to put this in comparative terms. I do think Zionism and the Zionist institutions help entrench this the kind of militaristic tendency of accumulation in U.S. society. I definitely think that's true. But, this idea that this tendency is a U.S. tendency, right? The same question, why not move to calmness, also applies to Russia. Russia wants to play ball with the U.S. Russia is not an anti-capitalist state. Russia wants to be included in a U.S. sphere, kind of calm sphere accumulation with the EU, and to some extent the U.S., but the U.S. planners are looking long term. They're like, okay, Russia linked to the EU, that could be an independent, delinked pole of accumulation, partially from our concerns. Actually, and what Trump wants to do, he just announced it, right? That the sovereign holdings of other countries can be rated by the U.S. I don't know what the geofinancial implications of that are. I read it before going to bed yesterday. But, the overall strategy is chaos and looting and accumulation by war. Right? So this nests into it. Now, I don't see it as otherwise. It also, I guess we should maybe close by talking a little bit more about what I think some of the lobby institutions are actually doing. But what I think is so important to keep in mind is that this is how Trump sees the world. This is how Biden sees the world. And, they're not discouraged from seeing this by their major donors, but there's not an evidence that this is separate from their class consciousness as they understand it, right? That hasn't really been established in any clear way. And the efficacy of an alternative path, and pause, but why are we as radicals envisioning other alternative paths for U.S. empire and accumulation? When did that become our job? This is so wild to me. I'm like, are we submitting our resume to the Middle East Institute or to Brookings for a better Middle East policy? Is this the Quincy Institution, which is bankrolled by the Koch brothers, by the way, in addition to whoever Open Society? I mean, is this our politics? I don't want there to be a ruling class, right? So I'm kind of mystified by this whole hullabaloo, because I want someone to tell me what is the political organizing strategy of this work. A young person was basically who said to me correctly, they were right about this. They were like, what you're saying about the lobby might be true to some extent, but all it is a falsification. It doesn't offer that much of an interpretive alternative. And I'm like, well, I believe in confronting the lobby institutions. I believe in confronting the Zionist Jewish institutions that are carrying out land sales and so forth. And I believe that in confronting the U.S. state. So what is the need for an energy expenditure on this analysis itself, right? What is the political consequence? This is what I always ask it. I ask it online from time to time. No one replies to me. I mean, I'm sort of shadow banned too, but I think it's a bit wild.
No, I think what is sorely lacking from many of these conversations and analysis that we see is the question of political economy, right? And the strategy of de-development and accumulation, right? So I guess in closing up then, and I appreciate you laying this out so systematically, right? And I think it's important that those who adopt a historical materialist take is that we always, when in centering the material, that changes, right? And the response and strategy changes, even though there's an overarching goal and strategy at play. So finally, I would say when we think of things take us to this current moment, how we understand the calls for disarmament. I mean, I think you kind of intimated a lot actually that we can kind of understand from what you've said, but people say this thing about, it's working for the establishment of the greater Israel, for example. right? That's what is commonly said. So how do you, I guess, respond to that, understand that, and then close us out within our current conjuncture?
Yeah, I mean, Israel is expansive. Like that's 100%, and it's expansive because it wants to expand its security frontiers, which it now understands even better than it used to. That the geography of its security frontiers is highly significant. It's always thought this way, right? And this has become even more clear to it after October 7th, when it was understood that it was precisely geographical proximity that can either be closed by human ingenuity itself, directly, like corporally, in the body of humans, right? Or can be closed technologically through Iran, right? That, in fact, all of Israel becomes frontier. And if your whole country is becoming, in a sense, a kind of a militarized armistice line in that sense, if that's the future of your country, which it appears to be, then it's logical you would want to try to push back on it by expanding the military frontier, right? And this is also, and it's also been inbuilt to do this protocol of Greater Israel, and so the expansion into southern Syria, the expansion into Lebanon, the expansion into the Sinai has always been contested because the Israelis and the Americans don't trust the Arab republics, right? I mean, Sisi is a full collaborator with the occupation. He's a full collaborator with the occupation. At the same time, Sisi has shifted the entire, much of the military purchasing of the Egyptian government to China and Russia. That is not necessarily the actions of someone who is seeing a long-term future in the U.S. pocket. I don't think so. I mean, again, and in a sense, it's neither here nor there. Like Egypt is a part and parcel of the occupation regime, right? But I also think that at the end of the day, I don't think the Israelis trust. I mean, I think they trust they trust like Saudi, and although they make a hullabaloo about Qatar, I think that's just for consumption, for media consumption. I don't think that's serious. But I don't think the Israelis, and to a lesser extent, the Americans trust their Arab partners, particularly, especially in the major population centers, right? Because they see that, okay, like they know what the popular classes, they know how the popular classes generally see the world. I mean, they see what happens when things get dislodged, for example, in Yemen. I mean, and by the way, Yemen, which we didn't talk about Yemen and Iran at all, which is okay. Like I think,
we can do a follow-up.
Your viewers might have like a lot of questions because it ended up being, I wanted to give this historical trajectory to have a better understanding of where this relationship came from. But look at what is Yemen, which is, the Ansar Allah are not Marxists, right? Although there are socialists in the political bureau, apparently. But, they have not just an anti-US ideology, but an anti-Israel ideology, but also an anti-US ideology. And the US, through Saudi Arabia, launched a genocidal war against Yemen that ended a few years ago. I mean, 500,000 people died in that war. That's the estimates. 500,000 people died in that war, which also finally raises the question, like, why don't people are like, what the U.S. doesn't have to upend its institutions in order to show any fealty to Saudi Arabia? I'm like, yeah, there's no opposition to the U.S. special relationship with Saudi Arabia in the United States, to the point that Saudi Arabia can kill 500,000 people for the U.S., people who are upholding an anti-Zionist and anti-U.S. banner. It can kill 500,000 people in an attempt to destroy that kind of nationalist government that took power in Yemen. It can kill 500,000 people, and you will not hear a whisper of organized dissent to it amongst the U.S. left. So you don't have to recruit Columbia and Harvard University to be your higher educational gendarmes to eradicate it, because the U.S. left isn't even paying attention to it in the first place. Let's be real. Do you think like that if there was a mass U.S. mobilization against the U.S. ties with Saudi Arabia, that the U.S. ruling class would behave very differently? That's wild to me. So again, I think there's a lot. The one thing I align with the people I totally disagree with about is that they find the arguments about like the aircraft carrier and so forth, like hackneyed and so forth, like, I'm a hater. So I always think our side should be doing much, much better. And I think this is a case where our side really should be doing much better and making better arguments. Like go back, there's a lot of older literature on it. Read Ali Qadri thought. I always say this, and and then we can have a debate on substantive grounds.
No. I think we'll close it there. I think again, that was a masterclass. So thank you so much. I was listening attentively, and I know this is something that I'm going to keep going back to, but I'm going to have it on record. I think we have to do a follow up to this. I think the historical trajectory is very important that you open up domains for us to think, and how do we apply analysis in a way that doesn't come across as so easily and we can just dismiss and say, oh, it's just the Israeli lobby. No, there's something much more profound play here. So thank you so much. And I'll speak to you soon.
All right. Great, Mamadou.